The Honourable Member for Lethbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will be splitting my time with the Honourable Member for Dufferin-Caledon. No one can minimize the very serious effects of COVID-19, the impact that it has had on our individual lives, our communities, and our entire country. The times we live in are certainly not normal, and the measures that have been implemented to mitigate the harm of the virus have been significant. In the very early days of the pandemic, Conservatives were eager to work with the governing party to find solutions for Canadians. We knew it was imperative to act quickly and effectively, so those feeling the negative economic impact of the mandated shutdowns were offered the support they needed. We called on the government to close the borders, a recommendation they ignored for months and sadly caused considerable damage. To prevent job loss, we urged the Liberals to increase the wage subsidy program from 10% to 75%. When our constituents told us about the problems they were having accessing the rent relief program and other emergency benefits, we immediately proposed changes and fought for them. It often took weeks or even months for the government to respond. Some we are still waiting, but eventually some solutions have been put in place. All of this was done with the understanding that measurable support must be given to help Canadians until the tide turns and a greater economic certainty is present. But here we are. We are nearly 1 year in, and we are at a precipice. Even though the country is facing an astronomical deficit and debt load, there is no plan for recovery, and there is no end in sight with regard to government spending. In the last year, our country has adopted many policies that in normal times would put us on track to mirroring other economies like Cuba or Venezuela, where masses of people are out of work and individuals are reliant on the government for their very survival. It is entirely unsustainable for any long period of time, but oddly, to our detriment, the current federal government is proposing that many of the measures which have been implemented during the pandemic become permanently entrenched. This is scary. The deficit for this year is projected to come in just shy of $4 billion, thus bringing the net national debt to a record of $1.1 trillion. That's a massive number, one that is incomprehensible for many of us. The proposed changes to the Borrowing Authority Act in this legislation will increase the gross borrowing limit to $1.8 trillion, an increase of a whopping $700 billion. I realize those are big numbers, but to boil that down, we are living in a credit card economy. We are consuming more than we produce. We are buying more than we sell. We are borrowing from the world in order to buy from the world. And we are sending jobs and money out the door in exchange for foreign goods. In essence, or in short, we are in trouble. Others get the jobs, the investment, and the savings. But Canadians, well, we're left with the debt. With the government's plan to increase spending, but no plan for economic recovery, Canadians should be concerned. It is the government's responsibility to facilitate an environment of economic prosperity. This is made possible by implementing policy that will draw investment into our country rather than repelling it, by putting policy in place that will encourage job creators instead of punishing them, and by implementing policy that celebrates those who work hard in the private sector instead of forcing them into a place where they're reliant on the government for bread. To sign off on the government's current intent to spend hundreds of billions of dollars without so much as a plan for economic recovery or accountability measures in place would be totally irresponsible of me and others in the House of Commons. The current government is providing poor leadership, and Canadians certainly deserve better. For Canada to get back on track, we must free the wealth creators, the innovators, and the risk takers. We must believe in the people of this great country. In response to a question about government spending, the Prime Minister said, "We took on the debt so that Canadians wouldn't have to." I hate to break it to him, but that's not exactly how it works. Governments don't have money. There's no special government bank account that money just gets deposited into without a source. And of course, that source is us, Canadians, taxpayers. The less revenue there is to tax, the less money there is to spend on social programs, healthcare, infrastructure, and education. For this reason, it's confounding that the Liberals do not fight for industries such as the energy sector or manufacturing or agriculture, industries that have traditionally helped stabilize our economy for decades. They're well positioned to continue to do so. They just need a government that believes in them. When the Prime Minister was embroiled in scandal over the SNC-Lavalin affair, you'll remember this, he pressured the former Attorney General to let a criminally charged company off the hook. And he did this under this guise. He said, quote, "I'm fighting for jobs." Well, what about the jobs here in Western Canada? What about the jobs that were just lost when Keystone XL went out the door? Why couldn't the Prime Minister do so much as pick up a phone, make a call, and advocate for those workers, those jobs? Does he only care about jobs if they happen to be in his riding? Canada deserves a Prime Minister who will fight for unity, not against it. A Prime Minister who believes that Canada is one nation from sea to sea, and that nation in its entirety is worth fighting for. The debt to GDP ratio will rise to 56% this year. That is just a short distance away from our 1996 high of 66%, when the Wall Street Journal deemed Canada to be an honorary member of the third world. Yikes. While the private sector is shrinking rapidly, the government is engorging itself. This is entirely unsustainable, but it is incredibly beneficial to a political party that is most successful when Canadians are dependent on government. You see, doling out money is actually a political leader's dream. It turns the people's affections toward him. It positions him as their hero, their caretaker, their savior, so to speak. Responsible leaders, they restrain themselves. They restrain themselves from utilizing this enticing tool. And instead of making it a long-term solution, they limit. They put restrictions in place. Our current leader, not so. Sadly, for quite some time, the current government has fostered animosity toward job creators and wealth generators. The Liberals are engineering a society that will leave everyone less prosperous and more dependent on government. While the Liberals love to talk about giving and receiving, I wish to talk about the value of earning. I'm talking about the privilege of work, the honor of work, the dignity of work. It is an incredible thing to earn what you receive. Studies show that individuals who receive money without earning it are actually more likely to be depressed and less likely to be happy or feel fulfilled. Whenever we discuss permanently increasing government handouts, we must look at the potentially negative ramifications, not just for the economy, but for society, the people. People matter. Canadians must be free to use their gifts, their talents, their abilities to further themselves, to benefit their local communities, to rebuild. Ronald Reagan famously said, the nine most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." I am convinced government programs are not the answers to getting Canada back on track. Canadians are the answer. It is Canadians who have the ingenuity, the work ethic, and the ability to come up with the solutions to the problems our country faces. Ronald Reagan also said that the greatest leader is not necessarily the one who does the greatest things. He is the one that gets people to do the greatest things. Frankly, I'm tired of hearing this government patronize Canadians by essentially telling them to sit on the sidelines and cheer. What coach benches his best players? Instead of putting the government in the position of the ultimate problem solver and exploiting the pandemic to increase government control in the lives of Canadians, I believe we have a real opportunity here to do just the opposite. We can shift the spotlight onto Canadians, those who are dreamers, risk takers, wealth generators, and job creators. It's time to put them in the game. They have the ability to put forward exceptional ideas, solve problems, and build toward a vibrant future. We must unleash the power of the workforce so Canadians can start receiving a paycheck instead of a government handout. The Liberals can try to reset, restart, and reimagine this country, but the fact is the power belongs to the people. Canadians always have been and always will be the solution to the problems we face. Mr. Speaker, it's time to let Canadians skate.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We continue to hear about the level of debt that's been taken on throughout this pandemic. I heard it a number of times yesterday. This member has mentioned it. Yet, at every step of the way through supporting Canadians and putting the resources in place to help them, this House pretty much on every occasion unanimously adopted the bills to be able to do that, the mechanisms to be able to do that. All that member had to do, or any other member of this House had to do at those instances when that unanimous consent came forward, was say no. One person, and it would have triggered a whole process that would have been so much more detailed into how we go about doing that spending, i.e. coming through various different stages in this House, through committee. That member didn't say no. No member said no. And I knew that the time would come that Conservatives would eventually start to critique the government for the level of debt that they took on. But in reality, they were active players to that. They participated in taking on that debt. How can this member justify being overly critical of the debt taken on when she voted for it at every step of the way?
Member for Lethbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is a place for taking on a small level of debt for a short term. That debt load, however, should have been incurred primarily in the name of generating jobs. So investing in projects and industries that are going to serve this country in the long run. That said, there is a time when, due to something such as a pandemic, it is appropriate for the government to provide assistance to those who need it most. It is no fault of their own that Canadians, many Canadians, lost their jobs. Government policy created a lockdown. That lockdown resulted in the loss of livelihood for many. That was a government decision. Therefore, the government is responsible to step in and help. I voted for that, and I'm proud of that vote. What I'm not proud of, though, is where this government is going for the long-term future, and that is incurred debt over debt over debt over debt on the backs of Canadians. That's wrong.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and Happy New Year. I just wanted to ask my honourable colleague, I know you spoke a lot about work. I too support the ability for Canadians to get jobs. However, we know that a lot of people are unable to work. I'll give an example. 70% of adults with severe intellectual disabilities live in poverty, who are unable to work. Seniors, unable to work, living in poverty. Many students who were unable to work as a result of the pandemic, living in poverty, unable to go back to school. Another example, Indigenous peoples, where in many communities where rates of unemployment are 95% as a result of ongoing impacts of the Indian Act and colonization. Again, unable to work. My question for the honourable colleague is that knowing this is certainly well researched, would my honourable colleague support a guaranteed livable basic income? And does my colleague support providing greater supports for students who, of no fault of their own, were impacted due to the pandemic? And would my colleague also support a guaranteed livable income for persons with disabilities who we know have been completely left out during the pandemic?
Honourable member for Lethbridge.
It's interesting because that question morphed from a celebration of work, which I was super excited about, to actually a squelching of work and its benefits. And that's very sad. We're talking about Canadians who have incredible potential, incredible ability, incredible gifts, incredible talents, incredible contributions to make to this great country. And by putting mechanisms in place that would bench them, we would actually be making our country worse off. Why don't we have a more grand vision for people than that? Why don't we believe in letting them thrive? Why don't we believe in letting them use those gifts and those talents and those abilities to be the problem solvers, to be the solution makers, to be the people that they were designed to be? Yes, I understand. There are some who live with a disability and they deserve all the support that they can get. Absolutely. And that is an appropriate place for government to step in and provide support to those who are unable to do so for themselves. But for the rest of us, let us skate. Let us use our gifts and our talents and our abilities to make this country a great place. Let us work.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Dufferin-Caledon.
58,000, Mr. Speaker. 58,000.